Hello viewers, and welcome to On the Case, my look at something in the news that I think is relevant and important. And today, I'm on the case of the Scottish referendum. Now you might be thinking, a little bit late, already happened, but the thing about it is that things are going apace with this. This isn't, this vote isn't the end of everything, it's actually the beginning. So I'm going to go through that, get towards the end, but for the start, talk about the referendum itself. So what was being asked was, should Scotland be an independent country? Now, in the end, the no side won with 55% of voting against independence, and the turnout was amazing. It was 84.6%. That's huge. I think it was something like 95% of people registered to vote. So, getting 84% is pretty amazing, given that, the average would probably be in the 60s somewhere. So, why did people vote no? Well, first we have to look at the reasons why people would vote yes. One of the first parts is that although Scotland has devolution, it doesn't really reflect the society as a whole. So, for example, only 13% of Scots voted Conservative, but they ended up getting a Conservative government in the last general election. Now, the idea of devolution is that Scotland can run its own, some of its own affairs. So, for example, they can have their spending on transport, on schools and hospitals. So, for example, in the UK, we have to pay a limited amount for prescriptions for drugs. Now that means that rather than spending the entire cost, let's say you have something that costs £1,000, you only spend you don't spend very much to actually get those drugs. Some are on the NHS, some are not. But you can have things like schooling, for example, that in the UK, as in England, that you have to pay to go to university. In Scotland, the government has covered the cost of that. So if you're a young student in Scotland, you don't have to pay your tuition fees. Now, the idea behind it is that people who get through university, they're more likely to spend higher on taxation. So therefore, it should work around a circular system. So, but the whole point of this a yes vote would be taking responsibility for Scotland by moving all government powers to Scotland. In other words, Scotland gets the government for the people who live there. So all in all, that sounds like a great idea. But unfortunately, this is where the no stuff comes in, because there was a problem with security. People really were insecure about what was going to be the future. So, for example, pensions. If you've got a country where the finances are a bit iffy, then can you be sure that you'll get your pension when you retire? People with children, people in need of better healthcare, is Scotland still going to be able to fund that if the finances aren't very good? Then you've got such things like military spending. Jobs linked to the UK, such as shipbuilding. A UK government has said that it wouldn't be willing to build warships in a foreign country, and at the moment, many of the warships are being built in Scotland. So they're going to move all that out. There's going to be job losses. There's going to be all sorts of problems that come from there, because it's not just affecting the shipyard itself, but it's going to cascade down, because obviously local firms are going to be supplying equipment, and it's all spread all over the UK. Different parts are built in different places. So, but what about other military hardware? Did Scotland think that the UK was going to give them a quarter of the Royal Air Force? I mean, I did a little bit of checking up, and if that was to happen, they would have expected 30 Typhoon jet fighters. That's £2 billion in military spending over the last few years. 25 tornadoes. they're coming towards the end of their lifespan, so they would need replacing soon. They do one or two of the sentries. A quarter of the rivet joint surveillance aircraft. What are you going to do? Then you've got two leased Airbus Voyagers that they would have expected. Two brand new, relatively new, Globemaster transports, 6 Hercules, 40 Hawk trainers, and 23 Chicano trainers. And then you've got things like helicopters, 12 Chinooks and 16 Apache gunships. Then you've got things like where they're going to get the ships. Scotland is covered by the sea, so where they're going to get the ships for that. Then you've got issues. So after the military spending, you've got issues of border control. Are you going to have to get on a train in Scotland and have to go through immigration and in order to to go down to London or something like that? It becomes quite awkward, and that's going to cause increased spending there, because when you're not just paying one company effectively, because right now we have one centralised immigration centre, or not centre, but the way that it's all handled by one group. Whereas if you split off and you've got your own one, you've got to have a head office and you've got to have letterheads and all that kind of stuff. It just becomes a bit of a nightmare, really. Having it in one location works out better. So one of the biggest ones was the pound. Now Britain basically runs the pound, and Scotland was under the impression that that Alex Salmond was under the impression that they'll just be allowed to use it. Well, why would they use a pound? That's a British currency. It has a lot of debt attached to it. Is Scotland going to take on the debt? They didn't. They said they didn't want to do that. So why would Britain let Scotland use the pound? So that becomes a problem. Britain could also veto Scotland from joining the EU as a separate nation. Then you've got the problem where the Scottish banks, RBS and Lloyds, would have to relocate because there's EU legislation that says that banks must have their head offices in the same member state as its registered office. And the directive broadly implies that the bank must have its legal home in the place where it carries out the bulk of its activities. The bulk of its activities are in London, because RBS owns NatWest, and NatWest has much more work going on south of the border than it does in Scotland. So there were all sorts of problems that were in there, and I'm just trimming the tops. So that's broadly the reason. It was just, there were so many insecurities that came out of it. Another example would be there were all sorts of things that Alex Salmond wanted to do to improve life for average people, but the only way to do that would be to have taxation that would cover those sorts of costs. So you've got the higher people pay more, lower people that pay less, and it kind of evens out the divisions. But how would they have been able to fund that if there's insecurities about the finances? Even if they wanted to join the euro, they would have problems because thanks to the fall of the decline with the euro problems that have been because of the problems with the euro in recent years, the euro countries have had to follow certain levels. So in other words, they've got to have really, really tight fiscal spending policies in order to be able to work on it. So how, if they're really, really limited to the scope that they're able to go to, how would they be able to use the euro? They probably wouldn't even be allowed to do it because, of course, they wouldn't have a strong currency. You don't want Joe Bloggs with his monopoly money joining. You want someone who's got a very secure currency. So that's a problem. So what happened? So what is the impact of this? Well, there's a few future problems that come in here. There's a sort of element of sectarianism. Will the vote result in a fractured Scotland? When you've got 45% of people who voted no, it's got to leave some people quite bitter. So is there going to be a rise of sectarianism, things like that? Is this going to bring people together, or has it driven a wedge between people? So that's a bit of a worry. But the biggest thing that's come out of this, and this is where I came from at the start, how does a vote of no make a difference afterwards? Well, it's not going to make much difference for Scottish people for the next generation, when there'll probably be another vote in the future. But for the rest of the UK, it's driven a wedge in there, because one of the promises that's been given is that there's going to be further devolution, that they'll be able to take more control of what happens in Scotland. But that means that Scotland has a bigger say there. So what about the rest of the country? Why should Scotland have more rights, so to speak, than the rest of the UK? So is it going to lead with an English devolution, local powers, mayors, things like that? Are we going to end up with a federal England or federal Britain? Where you've got Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland. Are we going to end up with a sort of Manchester and Liverpool? Are we going to end up with a sort of northeastern, federal state almost? Is it almost going to be like a bit like America? Where you've got a sort of local and national, kind of system. So how is this going to change? It's going to change the very fabric of the way that the government works right now. Are we going to end up with two classes of MP? Where's the balance going to be between national and a more powerful local government when it comes to elections? There's also an issue of something called the West Lothian question. The West Lothian question is how can an MP for Parliament, who in Scotland, is it fair that they can vote on something that only matters in England? Surely this doesn't sound fair. Well, although that sounds a reasonable thing, it does make it very difficult for Labour. Now, at the moment, we've got a Conservative government. Given how unpopular the Conservatives have been, there's a good possibility that we're going to end up with a Labour government again. Now, if we end up with a Labour government, a lot of the MPs, a lot of Scottish MPs are more likely to vote for Labour policies. So it would be much easier for Labour to push through policies that they want to enact. But if there's a ban on Scottish MPs voting for English matters, then that's going to make it much harder to do. And of course, as we've seen in more balanced as we've seen in more balanced times, it's very difficult for one to push something through to make any change. So you end up with pretty much the same as what you had before. And the whole point of voting is to, we don't like them, we want to get someone else, but the someone else isn't powerful enough to get anything through. So you don't get any change at all. So the future is going to be very interesting. The next few years are going to be very interesting in British politics.